Going back to Refugio County, why were there certain hot spots in the US like this one where all of a sudden you see this incredibly large deposit of fallout on a particular region? Can you explain kind of how that would have happened?
Sure. Weather. It ran into a rain cloud or a snow cloud, and came down. This happened all over the United States. And it happened in Texas. It happened in Louisiana. It happened everywhere. It happened in Boston. It happened in New York, upstate New York. It happened in Edina, Missouri. One of the hottest counties in the United States is Knox County, Missouri. It happened everywhere.
My name is Natasha Bajma, and these are my dogs, Charlie and Luna. We're embarking on the adventure of a lifetime, a 365-day journey across America with my Ford 350 Super Duty pickup truck and a truck camper. But this is no ordinary road trip. This is what happens when a disillusioned nuclear weapons expert, going through a midlife crisis, tries to begin a new career but can't quite get off topic. Radioactive Road Tripping is a travelogue show that documents my transformation from a longtime national security expert to a newbie director, cinematographer, and producer. So, hey everyone, I'm here today with Richard Miller. He's the president of Legis Corporation and a certified industrial hygienist. He's also the author of Under the Cloud and other books about nuclear testing and radioactive fallout. Richard, thank you so much for your time today.
Pleasure's mine.
So I'm wondering if you could explain to the audience a little bit about what it is you do for a living, because I'm not sure I understand fully.
Okay, I'm an industrial hygienist and a safety guy, and I've been doing this for a long, long time. I used to work with OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and among the things that we did, we'd visit sites and take a look at toxic chemicals and health hazards and various things like that. I left OSHA in, it was probably 1982, thereabouts, and got my own company going. And I do basically the same thing, only I work with companies that are interested in taking a look at their hazards. And I also work with attorneys, both on defense and plaintiff, in terms of toxic substances and health issues. Most recently, I've been working with a group of attorneys that are dealing with the railroads. And we're looking at asbestos, diesel, things of that nature, things that can cause damage to people's lungs and their system and so forth. And that's what I do basically for a living.
We got connected through a mutual contact of ours, and then I learned that you literally wrote the book on the impact of the nuclear fallout in the US. And I'll just try to show the book here if we can get it to show up, or I'll show it on an image. We both live in Texas. You're in Houston and I'm in Rockport, and I ordered your book and it came to my doorstep during the week of the Texas freeze. So for all who didn't know, we had sub-zero temperatures. Our grid was overwhelmed, electrical grid was overwhelmed. We lost power. I was without power and heat for an entire week when the temperature outside was 17 degrees. We're not prepared for that in Texas. My house got down to 34 degrees. I had to go and live with my parents for a week at 55 degrees. And this book came along and I decided I was wrapped up in a sleeping bag. We had nothing really to do, no internet, nothing. I was going to read your book, and it's about 400 to 500 pages. It's quite the brick. And I open it up and I get to basically page 7 of the first section. So I'm not that far in. On page 7, you're talking about the fallout that resulted from, I think it was the second or third test in U.S. atmospheric test at the Nevada test site in 1951. It was called Ranger Baker 2 was the name of the test. And you describe basically in your book the kind of the pathways for the radioactive fallout, both at 10,000 feet and 30,000 feet. So I'm just going to read the 10,000 foot trajectory. The nuclear debris crossed north of Las Vegas into Arizona, passing north of Phoenix and leaving the state at Paradise. It entered Mexico airspace over the Alamo Hueco Mountains, I hope I said that right, in New Mexico, then crossed back into the United States over Ruidoso, Texas. From there, it passed out over Big Bend National Park, then to Carrizo Springs, Texas, and out over the Gulf at Aransas Pass, Texas. And I literally froze there. I live in Aransas County, Texas. Aransas Pass is about 10 miles from me, and I sat there for a few minutes and did a double take. I've been a nuclear weapons expert for 2 decades. I'm certainly familiar with the fallout from the nuclear testing from 1951 to 1962, and the fact that people died from the radiation effects. They got cancer and they passed away as a result of those tests. I, however, assumed that the results were localized. And so here I was having a moment. I turned the next page, and you describe here kind of you show in graphic form, 3D graphic form, kind of, where the fallout was spread across the counties in the United States. And I see that the county that received the most fallout from this particular test was Refugio County in Texas. That's 1 county over from mine. And again, another double take. And so I would like to kind of start out our conversation understanding from you where this data came from that you put in your book. Why this is such a surprise?
Well, that's kind of a complicated question, but in 1983, Congress passed a law that was called 97414 that had a whole lot of things associated with it. And one of the things hidden away inside the law was they directed the Health Department, the Secretary of Department of Health and Human Services, to perform an analysis of radioactive fallout, specifically I-131. Now, that's iodine. And iodine, radioactive iodine, goes to the thyroid. And so they wanted to find out if fallout could cause thyroid cancer. And they asked a group of individuals, scientists working for the NCI, National Cancer Institute, to begin work on this thing. A guy by the name of Bruce Walkholtz and another gentleman worked on this for a while. And then maybe this thing was put on the shelf. No one knows. But they never really reported to Congress until someone in the Clinton administration, and this is like 15 years later, in the Clinton administration said, "Hey, what about that report that we were supposed to get?" And someone said, "Oh, holy cow, I don't know." And I guess, and then they go back and furiously put this thing together. I mean furiously. Some of the data that I saw, maps look to be scratched together by hand at the last minute, apparently. But they finally coughed up all this information, and I think it was October the 4th, 1997. Now we had information about iodine 131. But none of the others, okay? None of the other 124 fallout components. We only knew about one. So they published this on the internet. There was about 100,000 pages, they said. I think that's kind of pushing it. But they published this on the internet. And if you go to find it, if you look for it, you'd see 2 numbers. And there was no concrete number available. Like, for example, Refugio They didn't say, well, Refugio got 25 micro units of fallout. They didn't say that. What they did was they published this in terms of some arcane, and I mean arcane, statistics called geometric mean and geometric standard deviation. Now that's arcane. I know some statisticians, and I called them up. These guys had written a book, by the way. And I called them up and said, you guys know anything about geometric mean and standard deviation? And they go, nope, I don't think we use that, which kind of surprised me. So I called a guy by the name of Owen Hoffman that I knew, and I said, I want to convert this to a single number, an average, an arithmetic mean is the term for it. He said, sure, that's not a problem, and he sent me the formula. Okay, so now we can get it down to an arithmetic mean, to one number. And this number was available for every nuclear test across the entire United States for every single county in the United States. So we're almost there. But what I wanted to know was, what about the other radioisotopes? I mean, there's 125 of them at least. We know that. And it turns out that in 1981, 82, 83, there was a guy by the name of Harry G. Hicks. And he was a radiochemist for Livermore. And Harry put together an analysis of every single nuclear test, including the very first one, Trinity. And he analyzed these darn things, and he found out that there was, each one of them had its own spectrum of radioisotopes, okay? Which is kind of interesting. You could look at one spectrum of it's called a Higgs table. You could look at a Higgs table and say, oh, that was shot Harry from 1953 because there's beryllium or whatever in it. And so the cool thing about it was that Harry included iodine-131. And that's real important because the NCI in their entire study had iodine-131. So now we had the iodine-131 from each test, and we had all the other radioisotopes from each test. So all I had to do was to go in and run a ratio between the iodine-131 and all the other radioisotopes. And I said, well, that's too easy. That's really too easy. It had to have been done before. So I called up a guy who worked in the original 1997 study, really a terrific guy by the name of Lynn Anspaugh. Really a good guy. He had done some work in Chernobyl, and he was super. And he said, yeah, he said, that's how you do it. He said, it's cumbersome, but it's possible. I said, has anyone done it in DC, at the NCI? He said, no, not yet. He said, they haven't done it. And I said, well, I guess I could do it then. He said, yeah, I suppose you could. He said, it takes a lot of time. So I did it. It took about 2 years, and finally was able to determine what radioisotopes fell, where they fell, when they fell. And that's basically how it was done. It was all put together that way.
Let me see if I can create an analogy for the audience to better understand this. Let's say a test is like a cake. And so it has different ingredients. So each of the radioisotopes are a different ingredient. And you know that there's been 100 cakes and each one has had this much of an ingredient, particularly, and that's iodine. In this case, iodine is the ingredient of the radioactive tests. And there were different tests, different sizes of cakes. Some cakes had slightly different ingredients. Maybe beryllium was different for different tests because of the content of the bomb. Is that correct? So different types of
correct.
bomb?
Yeah,
okay.
That's absolutely true.
Okay. All right. So basically what you're doing, because you know the amount of one ingredient in the cake and you know how much relative to that ingredient the other ingredients would be in a cake, depending on the size, because this other guy at the lab had studied all of the tests, that then you could use that proportional to kind of recreate the cakes.
Correct.
Okay. 1997, all of this data gets released. You spend years analyzing it. It was a delayed late report that was required by Congress. They slapped it together. Why do you think, I mean, we're speculating now, why did it take so long for somebody to ask the question in 1983, does fallout cause cancer in the thyroid?
Well, you have to remember who was running the show in 1983, and that was the Reagan administration. And the Reagan, as somebody who was with OSHA in 1983, or actually in 82, things got kind of tough for the environment and for evaluating different types of chemicals and what have you. And this was during, of course, the Reagan administration. It was very difficult to push forward on these things. I did a cancer case that we found brain cancer, for example, in a refinery in, I believe it was 1979, 1980. And this was during the Carter administration. And we looked at this and we found a whole bunch of cases of brain cancer. And we were trying to decide what to do next. And then Reagan came in, and he had a gentleman by the name of Thorne Octor, who was the OSHA director at that time. And one thing led to another, and our study vanished. It basically stopped. Now, we published an article. In fact, it was the first article in the American Journal of Industrial Medicine on brain cancer in petroleum workers. And one of the weird things about it was I was talking to another guy who was working on this study, a guy by the name of Sandy Leffingwell. He's a physician. And I said, where do you think the brain cancer came from? And Sandy goes, maybe it was nuclear fallout. He said, the clouds crossed over Texas. And I thought to myself, maybe, why not, So that actually was the very first instance of my being interested in it. At the same time, I think there was no real push by the administration, certainly, to try to find out what was going on. And in Clinton's administration, there was a push for that. They were interested in what radiation could do. O'Leary was the energy boss at the time, and she opened up a whole lot of good information to people, to reporters, and so forth, that had been classified. So it was just the time, I think.
Going back to Refugio County, why were there certain hot spots in the US like this one, where all of a sudden you see this incredibly large deposit of fallout on a particular region? Can you explain kind of how that would have happened?
Sure. Weather. It ran into a rain cloud or a snow cloud, and came down. This happened all over the United States. And it happened in Texas. It happened in Louisiana. It happened everywhere. It happened in Boston. It happened in New York, upstate New York. It happened in Edina, Missouri. One of the hottest counties in the United States is Knox County, Missouri. It happened everywhere.
That was one of the things that I think was most profound about reading your book, is not only just how widespread the radiation is, but how randomly then it would fall very, in large quantities in certain areas. And the idea that you're walking along and it's a rainy day and that rain coming down on you is radioactive rain. I think if Americans would have known at the time, they would have been, absolutely horrified by that. You mentioned that your interest in this topic came about by the suggestion that someone working in the petroleum industry in Texas got brain cancer. Maybe it was radioactive fallout. And I've been thinking a lot lately. I've known a number of people in my circles, men who have been in their 60s and kind of heading for 70s, dying of very rare cancers, brain cancer, blood cancer, things like that. So can you talk about what you found about the connection between the fallout from the testing and increases in cancer rates?
In 2008, my co-author, a guy by the name of Leif Peterson, he worked at Baylor College of Medicine. He's a molecular biologist, really good guy, and an excellent author. We decided to put our heads together and try to find out if there was a link between, or an association, actually, a statistical association between cancer and nuclear fallout. And we focused on the Midwest, Missouri, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, Illinois. And we had the cancer data, and we had the fallout data. So Leif put all this material together and ran correlation coefficients, which is a type of statistical analysis. And sure enough, we found high correlations, significantly high correlations between certain types of cancer and fallout in this 5-state area. They included, as you'd expect, thyroid cancer, but it also found correlations with a rare cancer called a soft tissue sarcoma. And I believe we also found brain cancer highs, and we also found colon cancer for female. And there was a couple of others. But the issue was that we were able to do this from CDC data, Center for Disease Control, data that was published prior to 2005. Since that time, the Centers for Disease Control Wonder site, which is where you find all that information, has suppressed any incident of cancer, rare cancers or otherwise, if they're fewer than 10. Now, why did they do that? There is an outfit called NAPHSIS, NAPHSIS, and you can look them up on Google, but it's essentially, it is an organization, a nonprofit, it's not a government agency or anything like that, that has convinced the CDC to suppress this data, any incident less than 10. And so if you have a cancer cluster, which is what you'd expect, if you have fallout or even from industrial sites, you could get a cancer cluster, a rare cancer cluster. There's one in St. Louis County, Missouri, for example. It's a cancer cluster of appendix cancer. Have you ever heard of that before? Neither have I, but it's there. And it is also not on the CDC Wonder site because NAPHSIS has convinced them that they shouldn't publish that. Now, I don't know why, but they've convinced them they shouldn't do it. So the research that we did prior to 2005 and published it in 2008 probably couldn't be done now.
You mentioned correlation, and I think that's a really important term for the audience to understand. It's not causation, it's correlation. There are obviously other reasons why we get cancer. And so how do you know that there is a relationship? Is the correlation so high that you know that there is a direct relationship between the testing and cancer rates?
No, a correlation merely means that two things are occurring at the same time. For example, you can go to a city and find that there's a correlation between the cracks in the sidewalks and the poverty rate. Now, one doesn't lead to the other one. At the same time, if you go to a city and find that there's very few people vaccinated, you're going to see a high COVID rate. That is causation, you see. So it doesn't necessarily mean causation, but it can. And that merely means correlation means that two things occur together. And the higher the correlation rate and the greater the number, the greater the significance is a good way to put it. To the point where you can say that the chances of this being random are less than 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000.
One of the things I noticed when I was reading that chapter is Mexico, right? This fallout entered Mexico. And then when I looked at the map where you kind of did a splatter of the fallout across the entire United States, I'm sure some of it made it into Canada because Michigan is just like west of Ontario. So I could
Absolutely.
Whatever blew over Michigan blew over Canada, right? So when we're talking about the detonation of a weapon out in Nevada, which is quite far away from Ontario, Canada, if we were to have, for example, a small-scale nuclear war, it doesn't have to be in the United States. I assume that there would be effects for a lot of different countries and a lot of different populations around the world. What's your thinking on that?
Oh, there's no question about it. First of all, it would be like the day after, that movie from 1982 or 83, November of 83, I think is when that was. It would be devastating for the area and devastating downwind. If you have 3 or 4 or 5 nukes, you're going to have a severe problem with fallout, even on the other side of the world. This stuff could float around in the stratosphere for a while and then come down years later in fairly large doses. No, it's a massive problem. It's a huge problem. It'd be unacceptable to anybody.
Thank you so much for your time. I think this was incredibly informative.
Not at all, anytime.
If you want to follow my journey, please remember to subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you'd like to have access to behind-the-scenes content and exclusive merchandise, become a patron at patreon.com/Natasha Bajema